Here is a collection of horror stories based on supernatural encounters during an internship at various hospitals in Beijing, gathered from a post on a Chinese forum. In 2005, I finally finished my student days and officially began working at a military hospital in Beijing. I graduated from a military academy and never really believed in ghosts. But once I started working at this hospital, which seemed to be a place brimming with eerie energy, I came to understand what real fear feels like. As a new employee, I had to rotate through each department for a few months before getting my permanent assignment. Let me get straight to the point and tell you about the operating room. 2 days after I started in the OR, I was scheduled for the night shift. Around 2 in the morning, there were no emergency surgeries, so my supervisor and I went to the on-call room to rest. Just as I lay down, my supervisor suddenly said, "Oh, right, we need to turn on the UV lights in the operating rooms to disinfect them. Go take care of it." I was stunned. There were 16 operating rooms in total, and I had to switch them all on by myself. I had no choice. Scared or not, I had to go. The corridor in the OR was eerily silent, especially since all the lights were inside the operating rooms themselves, leaving the hallway dark. I forced myself to walk down that corridor, the sound of my own footsteps echoing around me, feeling more nervous with each step. When I reached the seventh operating room and opened the door, for a moment, I thought I saw someone standing next to the operating table. My blood rushed to my head. I went completely blank. After standing frozen for about a minute, I looked again and saw there was nobody there, just the orthopedic leg support standing by the table. I let out a shaky laugh at my own fear and went inside. Because the UV lamp switches weren't by the door, I had to walk to the wall across from the operating table to turn them on. After I flipped the switch and turned around, it looked like there was a person lying on the table who suddenly fell to the floor and vanished. That figure seemed to be only half the height of a normal person. I completely lost it and ran out of the OR screaming. The dim purple glow spilling out from the small window in the door made the hallway even more terrifying. I sprinted back to the on-call room and sat on the bed, almost in shock. It took a while before I managed to calm down enough to tell my supervisor what had happened. He stared at me for a long time and then asked, "You've never met anyone from this hospital before, right?" I replied that I hadn't. He didn't say anything more and just told me to go back to sleep, insisting I was probably just overly tired and stressed. Worried, I asked if I should still turn on the UV lights in the remaining operating rooms. He said, "Don't worry about it. Tomorrow's the weekend. If there's an emergency surgery, we'll just use the rooms you've already turned on." Sometime later, after I finished my rotation in the OR and moved on to orthopedics, I heard from the doctors that a girl who had jumped off a building was brought in, and they had performed a double leg amputation on her. Before they could even finish the operation, she died on the operating table. Strangely enough, about an hour after she passed, when they were about to move her body, it suddenly slid off the operating table on its own before anyone even touched it. Let me tell you about my time in the orthopedics department. After I left the operating room rotation, I moved to orthopedics, which felt pretty relaxed. My supervisor didn't demand much, so my days were spent flipping through patient charts, joking around with a few of the interns, and sharing amusing stories from our school days. I only stayed there for about 2 weeks, though, before they pulled me over to help in the ER. During one of my orthopedics night shifts, my supervisor turned in early, leaving me alone with a single nurse in a big, empty nurses' station. At some point in the middle of the night, the nurse, exhausted, fell asleep right at the desk, so I was on my own. There weren't many patients to check on, so after wandering the ward for a bit, I settled in the office to read. That's when I heard it. A sound like someone coughing in the department head's office next door. I thought maybe he'd come in late, so I got up to look. The door was unlocked, but it was completely dark inside. No sign of anyone. I brushed it off, convinced I was just mixing it up with noises from the ward. Then I sat back down, and the cough came again. Louder this time. followed by what sounded like someone being patted on the back, wheezing as though they were struggling to breathe. There was even a faint beeping noise, like a heart monitor. Alarm bells went off in my head. I hurried over to wake the nurse, telling her we needed to check the patients. But the second she stood up, all the noises vanished. I insisted I'd really heard something, but she just looked at me skeptically, pointing out that neither of us had left the station, and certainly no one else had walked by. She decided to take a bathroom break, leaving me alone. The moment she left, that coughing started again, along with what sounded like quiet sobbing. This time, I was sure it was coming from inside the department head's office. Summoning my courage, I marched over and threw open the door. Just as before, the second the door swung open, silence fell. I flicked on the lights and left them on until dawn. Not another peep. 2 days later, I was reassigned to the ER and never brought it up again. Over a year later, I was chatting with my orthopedic supervisor, and he mentioned how stubborn the department head was. He refused to change offices despite how cramped it was. "That used to be our CCU and ICU," he said offhandedly. "It's right beside the old critical care ward. Countless patients died there, but he doesn't seem bothered at all." A chill crept over me as I remembered that eerie night, and I've never looked at that little office the same way again. Let me tell you another story. This one happened in one of the hospital corridors. Before our new building was constructed, there was a long hallway linking the old building and the really old building. That corridor was practically pitch black most nights because they rarely bothered turning on the lights. The lab was tucked all the way down at the end, in what was basically a dead end. A single stairway was there, but it had been blocked off halfway up, so the lab sat in this little cul-de-sac. One stormy evening, rare for Beijing, at around 3 in the morning, we got an emergency call. A couple had been fighting at home, and in the heat of the moment, the wife smacked her husband's head with a kitchen knife. Despite all the blood, he wasn't actually critically injured, just really banged up. She arrived with the police still screaming insults at him. Naturally, I didn't want them disturbing other patients. Why? So I dragged them both into the office. The cut on his head was big enough that it needed stitches, which meant we had to do the usual tests: HIV, syphilis, and coagulation checks. So I drew his blood. Normally, the service team would deliver the samples to the lab, but they were all out on a call. I couldn't just let the patient bleed forever, so I ended up hauling those vials of fresh blood to the lab myself. Down I went in the old building's elevator to the first floor, then through that pitch black corridor. There wasn't a single functioning light down there. Typical, right? I had to use my phone's flashlight just to see where I was going, navigating that sloped, twisty passage. When I finally reached the lab, the door was locked, and I fumbled around in the dark trying to find a doorbell. No luck. So I knocked on the old wooden door, and the echo in that hallway nearly gave me a heart attack. It was so loud. The half-asleep lab tech eventually opened up, grumbling about being woken at 3 in the morning, as if I had a choice. Once I handed off the blood samples, I turned back toward the corridor. It was still pitch black, so for courage, I started singing quietly to myself. That's when I heard it. Footsteps behind me, and the squeaking sound of something being pushed, like a cart. But it was the middle of the night. There was no reason for anyone to be wheeling anything around. I froze. The noise kept coming closer. Then, poof, silence. I whipped around to look. Nothing. Not a soul in sight. By then, I was on the verge of losing it. I shouted, "Stop scaring me!" But of course, nobody answered. I dashed back to the elevator and peered around. Still nothing. To this day, I have no idea if I was just jumpy or if something was really following me. I told one of my classmates about it, and he just laughed, saying I must have been hallucinating. "Sure," I told him. "If I were actually schizophrenic, do you think I'd still be working here?" I'm still not entirely convinced I imagined it, though. That corridor was way too creepy for my liking. Here's another story from my internship days in the cadre ward. The hospital had just created this department not too long before, and since there wasn't an official ward yet, they temporarily set it up in what used to be the hospital's guest house. The place was still basically a hotel. Every room had a private bathroom, a telephone, all that. Being the cadre ward, they mostly took in a few high ranking military officers and some wealthy patients who could afford single rooms. The nurses there were all very pretty too, like something out of a TV drama. Anyway, I was interning in this cadre ward, and because so many students were assigned there, I ended up sharing a supervisor with another intern. One night, the three of us had a shift together, but around midnight, the supervisor mysteriously disappeared. Honestly, it happened all the time, so we didn't think too much of it. There I was, sitting at the first floor nurses' station with a lovely nurse named Tian, chatting about nothing in particular, when a phone started ringing upstairs. The cadre ward was split into 2 floors. The nurses' station was downstairs, and the doctor's office, plus more patient rooms, were upstairs. After a few rings, Tian handed me a big ring of keys and asked me to go check which room it was coming from. It might be one of the empty rooms, she said. If nobody's in there, just unplug the phone line. So off I went, climbing the dark stairwell with only the faint overhead light for company. The corridor upstairs was quiet, almost too quiet. I crept down the hallway, pressing my ear to each door, but the ringing was so persistent it was almost disorienting. Usually a phone will stop after a few rings, but not this one. It just kept going, echoing off the walls. Eventually, I pinpointed it. The sound seemed to be coming from a room we used as a sort of storage area for the doctor's files. I tried half a dozen keys before the door finally clicked open, and the moment I stepped inside, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was pitch black, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. Now, looking back, I really should have just pulled the plug on that phone, but curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I picked up the receiver and said, "Hello?" Silence. No static, no background noise, nothing. Just when I was about to hang up, I heard a voice. It was a woman, speaking slowly in a hollow, almost echoing tone. "I'm so cold." I swear my heart stopped. I didn't even say another word. I bolted out of there and tore down the stairs 2 at a time. I couldn't risk yelling. The patients were all asleep, and the last thing I wanted was to cause a bigger scene. By the time I reached the nurse's station, I was trembling so hard I practically collapsed into Tian's arms. After I managed to explain what had happened, she looked terrified too. Neither of us dared go back upstairs, so we just stayed put at the station, anxiously watching the minutes crawl by. When I finally got a grip, I called the hospital switchboard, asking them to trace the incoming call to that room's phone. The operator spent an hour checking, then finally said, "I'm sorry. There are no records of any incoming calls to that line tonight." Even now, I have no explanation for that phone call, just the memory of that cold, lifeless voice echoing in the dark. I still get goosebumps every time I think about it. Let me continue with the next story. My time at the hospital was a mix of joy and misery. Joy, because most of the senior staff barely asked us military cadet interns to do any menial tasks. Those were generally foisted on the local interns. Misery, because we ended up in some truly bizarre and unnerving situations, like the one I'm about to share. This incident happened back when the hospital had just set up the cadre ward. They didn't have any real ward space yet, so they temporarily converted an old church on the hospital grounds into our dorm. It was a rundown building with a long history, so old that even the wooden floors squeaked ominously with every step. Actress Fu Biao's parents used to be high-ranking patients here and lived in the nearby staff housing, so the area had a certain old-world charm, but also a deep sense of decay. The church itself looked like something out of a horror movie, with a crooked cross on top, surrounded by towering trees. In the moonlight, their shadows stretched across the stone walls like grasping fingers. Inside, the space had been turned into something vaguely resembling dormitories, big rooms partitioned by flimsy walls that offered zero privacy or soundproofing. 18 of us military cadets were crammed into one cavernous room on the 3rd floor, while the local nursing students took another room on the same level. No matter the season, we had to keep the lights on 24/7 because it was otherwise pitch black and the place always felt cold. Even in the height of summer, we'd pile on our thick military blankets at night as if the chill seeped out of the very stones. One of my bunkmates, a girl who slept on the top bunk, kept having these recurring nightmares. She claimed to see an old foreigner trapped in some kind of water dungeon, chained to a chair, half drowned and beaten senseless. We all laughed it off at first, telling her she just had an overactive imagination or had watched too many horror films. But then came a night I'll never forget. I'd worked the first half of the night shift and decided I wasn't tired yet, so I left early to head back to the church. The walk itself was chilling. It was perched on a small hill surrounded by rustling trees, and the large stained glass windows were so dirty they reflected strange, distorted shapes. I was wearing my military uniform, which usually gave me a sense of confidence, but that night, every footstep echoed like a heartbeat in the darkness. When I finally got inside and climbed up to the third floor, I was just about to unlock the dorm room door when a blood-curdling scream shattered the silence. Ah! It was so sudden, I nearly dropped my keys. I realized the sound came from the communal washroom, the water room, so I rushed over. A few of my roommates were already there, huddled around a local nursing student who was sobbing on the tile floor. Through gasps and tears, she said she'd gotten up to use the toilet and then stopped at the mirror to wash her hands. She glanced up, and in the reflection, right behind her, was a gaunt foreigner with a face smeared in blood. That's when she screamed. By the time we arrived, there was no one else in the mirror, just her own terrified reflection and the flickering fluorescent light overhead. We did our best to calm her down, but we all knew there was something very wrong with that place. When we reported it, the higher-ups either didn't believe us or didn't want to stir up trouble. About a month later, a similar incident happened, and after more complaints, they finally decided to move us out. The church was then sealed off for being structurally unsound. The last I saw of it, in 2007, it was still locked up tight. Sometime after, I ran into one of our old supervisors, who mentioned that the church might be demolished. First, though, they wanted to make sure it didn't have any historical or cultural value, so they did some cleanup in the basement. I was shocked. "It has a basement?" I asked. Apparently, only the very oldest staff knew about it. According to local lore, the church dated back to the time of the Eight-Nation Alliance, built by the French. The basement was a watery dungeon, a place used for imprisoning spies. No one knows how many people died down there, but it must have been more than a few. And that, of course, brought me right back to my bunkmate's strange dreams about a foreign man locked in a water cell. It still gives me chills to think about what might be lurking under those old stones, lost to time, and yet somehow still reaching out to haunt our nights. Here is another story, which I've separated into two parts. Part 1, the anatomy lab ordeal. It was the second semester of my freshman year when we finally started our hands-on anatomy course. Before that, it was all dry lectures, cells, muscles, nerves, and endless slides in a makeshift classroom on the top floor of our lab building. It felt more like a rundown village school than a proper university, but at least it was something. Then came the big day. Our first real dissection lesson in the anatomy lab. The entire first floor of that building belonged to the dissection department. Specimen rooms, slice labs, all kinds of strange setups. But what really made my heart pound was the main hall, where they stored entire cadavers. Stepping inside, I almost cried, but not from fear. It was the overwhelming stench of formalin that made my throat close up and my eyes burn. My classmates and I stood in rows of 6 around each empty metal table, waiting for our instructor, this incredibly handsome rock star professor who seemed like he belonged on a runway instead of a morgue. When he finally swept in, he didn't waste time on introductions. He looked right at me and said, "I need an assistant." I followed him to a massive metal-covered pool at one end of the room. He pulled aside the lid, and I nearly gagged. The tank was filled with murky fluid and submerged bodies. He fished out a hook and latched it onto a tiny metal ring at the back of one cadaver's skull, then hauled the head above the surface. Water and chemicals dripped from its eyes, its mouth half open as though gasping for air. "Hold this," he told me, and I, being the naive freshman, complied, gripping the hook with both hands. He reached in to lift the cadaver's legs so we could get it onto the table. I'd never been that close to a corpse before. It felt like its eyes were rolling back, and I swore I saw the corpse's mouth twitch upward into a ghastly grin, somewhere between a smile and a grimace. With a yelp, I lost my nerve and let go of the hook, sending the body sloshing back into the tank with a huge splash. Formalin went everywhere, and I blacked out for a moment from a mix of fumes and raw terror. When I finally came to, my ears were ringing, and my classmates were staring at me. That was my unforgettable initiation into the world of dissection, something that still haunts my dreams whenever I catch even a whiff of anything resembling formalin. Part 2, a chilling night in the SARS ward. A few semesters later, I found myself volunteering, or perhaps conscripted, in our hospital's newly designated SARS ward. It was the early days of the outbreak, and fear hung over us like a thick fog. The ward was actually the old tuberculosis wing, an ancient, dimly lit building from the 1970s, perched on a hillside far from the main complex. Because it was so isolated, the city decided our hospital would be perfect for treating SARS cases. Lucky me. We knew so little about SARS back then, except that it killed people fast and even medical staff weren't safe. We lived in near lockdown. Whenever friends came to visit, we had to stand on a balcony, waving white cloths and shouting to them from far below, like we were under siege. The TB ward itself felt like a relic: dark corridors, flickering lights, and a constant draft that whispered through the hallways. One overcast afternoon, I was assigned to a smaller isolation room holding 4 patients, 2 6-year-old children and an elderly couple. The wife had caught SARS first and then passed it on to her husband, whose condition was much worse. He'd been on a ventilator, but that day showed signs of improvement, so the doctors decided to remove his breathing support. We moved them both into a single room so they could keep each other company. That night, around 8 p.m., I was doing my routine check, still just an intern trying not to fumble, when I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. On the other side of the curtain, the elderly wife whispered, "My dear, it's been so many days. We have to leave soon. If we wait any longer, I'm afraid those 2 children next door will pay the price for us." My mouth went dry. How did she know about the kids in the other room? Her husband, voice still raspy, replied, "All right, I'll listen to you. But we have no children or family of our own. Who will take care of our bodies when we're gone?" She answered, "We'll leave at 9. Not too late. The roads are hard to walk when it's dark." Goosebumps prickled over my arms. Leave at 9? Where on earth were they planning to go? And why mention the kids like that? I bolted to the office and told my supervisor. He dismissed me, basically saying I was just too high-strung. I tried warning the nurse on duty, telling her to keep an extra eye on the couple, but I wasn't sure if she believed me. By 10:30 p.m., it was time to distribute the late-night meds. The nurse went in and found them both dead, holding hands, already in rigor mortis. There hadn't even been a chance to attempt CPR. That nurse was so rattled, she came down with a high fever 3 days later and had to be admitted to our own unit. Thankfully, after a heavy course of steroids, she survived. To this day, the memory of that couple's final conversation still makes me shiver. It was as if they knew the exact moment they'd depart. And a part of me still wonders if their fear of owing a debt to those children somehow sealed their fate. As I learned both in the anatomy lab and the SARS ward, sometimes the scariest things in medicine aren't the ones you see under the fluorescent lights, but the eerie whispers and unexplainable moments that follow you long after your shift ends. Here is another one. A haunting dream. I was working in the cardiothoracic surgery department, my final post after all my rotations, and we often admitted young children with congenital heart defects, some barely over a year old. One night, I was asleep in the dorm when I had a dream that still chills me to this day. In the dream, a little girl, pigtails tied neatly, shiny red shoes on her feet, appeared by my bedside. She was adorable, standing there and calling me big sister, asking me to play with her. Half awake in the dream, I asked her what she wanted to play. She didn't seem to know, only insisting that she wanted my company. I murmured something like, "Give me a moment. I'm really sleepy," when she suddenly burst into tears, crying out again and again, "It hurts. It hurts so much." Before I could make sense of it, the girl climbed onto my bed and pulled open her shirt. I saw a huge incision running from her collarbone down to her stomach, with some sort of chest spreader holding her ribs apart, her heart still visibly beating. I screamed so loudly that I woke myself up, drenched in cold sweat. For a while, I tried to shake off the dream, but a few months later, I casually mentioned it to an older nurse in my department. She looked at me for a long time and finally asked if I was serious. When I said yes, she went quiet. Then, about a month later, I was on a calm night shift and started reviewing old patient records. I stumbled upon a file from June 1997 and nearly dropped in shock. A 5-year-old patient with congenital heart disease who had died post-surgery. I confronted that same nurse, and she confessed that a little girl matching my dream had indeed passed away back then. "I braided her hair into 2 pigtails and put on her new red shoes," she said. She never wanted to go. My whole body went cold. Living in the old ward. If that wasn't unsettling enough, the hospital soon gave us new dorm assignments that only got stranger. We were experiencing a housing shortage, so someone in administration decided to convert part of an old ward into rooms for us to stay in. Yes, an actual former hospital ward, complete with a grim history, was now our temporary dormitory. The building itself was from the 1960s, connected by a long corridor to an even older facility. Patients had died there for decades. It didn't help that the place wasn't even properly disinfected or renovated. I was assigned to share a room with another girl in what used to be the neurosurgery emergency room. Within days of moving in, my roommate said she felt uneasy, hearing the faint beeping of medical machines at odd hours, or dreaming of figures with bandaged heads reaching out for her. Less than a month later, she moved out entirely, leaving me alone. You'd think having the room to myself would be a relief, but then something happened that scared me beyond reason. The room was basically a single space with a small balcony that doubled as a bathroom area. I'd installed a large, full-length mirror in there. To make matters worse, from the balcony, you could see right into the new building's operating rooms. One day, my supervisor, whom I called Teacher, came over to hang out. I happened to be bathing a little pet pig I was keeping at the time. Yes, a tiny pet pig. After rinsing it off, I stepped out to grab a hairdryer, leaving him alone for a moment. Suddenly, he bolted out of the bathroom with a loud scream, rushed over to my bed, and just sat there shaking, tears streaming down his face. My first thought was that the pig must have bitten him, but that wasn't it. He was pale, practically speechless. Finally, he managed to say, "When you left, I thought I'd pick up the pig and look at us in the mirror. But the moment I stood in front of it, I didn't see my own reflection. Instead, there was this woman. She was wearing a hospital gown. I couldn't tell her age. She slowly turned around in the mirror and smiled at me." He was so terrified, he ran out without even thinking. That was enough for me. Maybe he really saw something. Maybe he didn't. But considering how many people must have died in that ward over the years, I wasn't about to take any chances. From that day on, I sealed off the bathroom door and used the communal restroom at the end of the corridor. I also convinced another friend, someone I didn't even get along with all that well, to move in with me, just so I wouldn't be alone at night. And whenever I did have to use that big mirror for any reason, I made sure never to look directly into it again. Thank you for listening so patiently. Here's the final story. One evening, late in 2006, just before the new year, I was on duty in an unusually quiet ward. Most patients had been discharged for the holidays, leaving my colleague and me with little to do. We ended up swapping tales about unusual occurrences we'd heard around the hospital. As expected, that only heightened our sense of unease. The dim lighting and silence added to the atmosphere, and I found myself feeling increasingly nervous. Hoping to shake off the tension, I excused myself to wash my hands. As I entered the treatment room and approached the sink, the automatic hand dryer suddenly activated with a loud whoosh. These machines are designed to work only when someone places their hands under the sensor, yet there it was, operating on its own in an empty room. Startled, I rushed back to my colleague. Despite being a calm and composed person, he was equally unnerved and refused to check it out. Finally, a nurse volunteered to inspect the situation. She unplugged the dryer, but when she returned, she looked pale and unsettled. After some coaxing, she admitted that she had felt an inexplicable chill when unplugging the machine. The next day, when we recounted the incident to senior staff, they brushed it off with a knowing smile, saying, "Strange things happen when you let your imagination wander at night." The young girl in the ward. In our hospital, there were occasional accounts from patients about seeing a young girl who would appear before them. My supervisor believed this recurring story might stem from the emotional atmosphere of the hospital, where life and death intersect daily. He recounted two such experiences. In one case, a patient recovering from surgery told him about seeing a young girl standing in the doorway of his room. The man described her as simply watching him. My supervisor saw nothing unusual but tried to reassure him. The following day, the patient unexpectedly passed away during the night. Not long after, a similar event occurred. An elderly patient awaiting a procedure described seeing a girl in his room. Despite attempts to keep him calm and distracted, the patient insisted on returning to bed. That evening, another patient remarked about a mysterious girl they had noticed near the ward. Later that night, the elderly patient's health took a sudden turn, and he did not survive. These accounts left my supervisor reflecting on the emotional toll of working in such an environment and the human tendency to seek meaning or comfort during times of vulnerability. An eerie dream. Another story emerged from a different department, where a psychologist shared an unusual case involving a patient plagued by vivid nightmares. The patient dreamed repeatedly about a tragic event involving his spouse. Concerned, the psychologist explored these dreams and recommended further evaluation. Months later, a tragic incident resembling the patient's dream occurred. Investigations revealed that the crime was carried out by individuals the patient was acquainted with, although he was uninvolved. This coincidence left the psychologist pondering the limits of human perception and intuition, emphasizing the need for compassion and understanding in the face of life's uncertainties. And that concludes my final story. As much as we try to explain things logically, some moments in life challenge our understanding. In places like hospitals, where profound events often occur, perhaps it's natural to reflect on the mysteries we encounter.